Hello, everyone. My name is Charlie Noyes. I am an investor at a venture capital investment firm called Paradigm, and longtime fan of Cosmos. And I'm here today to talk on the security of interoperability. Although I don't think the Cosmos will appear until somewhere around slide 45. So to start, quick definition of kind of the context we're working in here. Everyone's gone already. Already given this pitch better than I could, but basically, we got some blockchains, and how do we incentivize them or their consensus participants rather to follow intended behavior? How do we make a blockchain secure? So I'm going to talk about first 3 axioms of security, each of which are kind of interrelated. And I think present some interesting mental models with which to think about blockchain security in the long term. So the first is that regularity is security. This is kind of just a long time known observation, originally from a paper called On the Instability of Bitcoin Without the Block Reward by some folks at Cornell, I believe it was, which, essentially makes 2 observations. The first is that only stable and predictable minor revenue streams, such as inflationary block rewards, actually create an incentive for miners to securely extend the chain. The second observation might just seem like the reverse of the first, but it's actually a bit more interesting, which is that irregular and unpredictable minor revenue streams, including demand-based transaction fees, so like the kind that you would think about, on like standard Bitcoin TX fees, or on Ethereum, like priority gas auction revenue, actually creates an incentive for miners to 51% attack and reorg the chain. And this is kind of in a vacuum, ignoring anything else about what's happening on it. The rough idea is just that if some blocks are richer in fees and some are poorer, then relative to the block reward, like you can get into a situation where miners are incentivized to reorg the chain rather than securely extending it, just because the transaction fee revenue stream is unevenly distributed between blocks. So that's it there. All right, we've got our first couple observations here. The next is a little more contentious, and it is that users are assumed harmful, or users are parasites. This descends down from, the basic idea here is that behavior occurring at a blockchain's application layer, so like whatever users are doing on top of a blockchain can, and in practice does, create incentives for consensus participants, which are not contemplated in the core protocol. And this idea is rooted, I would say, in the paper Flash Boys 2.0, which was the first to really explore this idea, pretty deeply. And they coined the term minor extractable value to describe these extra protocol incentives that are created by sort of application layer behavior. It's one of the more nuanced ideas here. So we're going to briefly explain what minor extractable value actually is, although I'm sure many of you already know. All right, so we got Phil's paper here. It's awesome stuff. It's definitely worth reading. So what is MEV? All right, we start with Ethereum. We got a couple characters. We got the Ethereum blockchain. We got a friendly miner. Got Dan and Charlie. That's my partner, Dan Robinson, right there. Both degenerate traders. And we got a DEX contract on Ethereum. And you can just place orders to buy and sell stuff on Ethereum. Nothing special. So I want to buy 1 Ether for $200. I'm feeling lucky. It's a bull market. And I send this in to the miner, get it in his unconfirmed transaction pool here. And nothing really special is going on. He mines it. I pay a little fee to him. I've got it in there. And you might be able to spot the error already. We're on to the next block. My order is in the DEX contract. It hasn't been taken yet. And I realized I fat-fingered it and put $2,000 instead of $200. So we got a problem here. Dan is not a gambler, and he'll take a great deal when he sees one. So I'm buying Ether for 10 times what it's worth, and he wants to take this order. It's not over for me yet. I can see that Dan's transaction only included, a modest little $1 fee there. And if I just pay a little bit more, I can cancel this offer before Dan takes it, because the miner will give my transaction priority as the one paying the higher fee. Sadly, Dan is actually Danbot, and he robotically outbids me within seconds. And yeah, the intuition here, Danbot pays extra fee to miner to front run Charlie. But it doesn't end there, because I'm now down here. I don't really have much of a way to compete. Danbot's really, he's really putting the screws to me here. And, but Ethereum's I'm a non-GMO trader. So, Ethereum's a public blockchain, so we actually get another character, Danbot 2. And he sees that, Danbot's only paying $3 for real juicy, like, what's it, $1,800 profit opportunity here. And so he comes in and he's like, all right, I'll bid $4. Now in practice, it's not going to be like a $1 bid. There's like, you should read the paper because there was some interesting dynamics. But in general, the idea here, all right, so these guys are going to start, Danbots here are going to start competing over this transaction. I left $1,800 on the ground. They're going to go back and forth, Danbot, 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 Danbot. All right. And our original Danbot wins. He paid $1,799 in fees to the miner, but he still makes out with a modest $1 profit. So yeah, this is MEV. And all right, so what do we learn here? This DEX scenario was an example of MEV able to be captured over the span of a single block. Priority gas auction, or the bidding war between Danbots, allowed them to capture it based on ordering within a single block. And it's going to get captured one of two ways, like we just saw, with non-miner arbitrageurs competing to play out, that gas auction bidding war in order to capture the MEV that I created. And although this isn't true in practice, because there's like network latency and some other idiosyncrasies to like how much you have to outbid the other party for a miner to accept, like your higher bid. Phil's paper goes over this. Like in equilibrium, we would assume that there's no arbitrage. So we would assume that Danbot ends up paying like functionally the value of the arbitrage, and there's not just like free money left on the ground. As a point, it's more of a theoretical assumption, or what should happen long term. There's a second way that this can get captured, though. Alternatively, the miner simply censors competing transactions to capture it themselves. And from the perspective of miners' incentives, this is equivalent to just receiving the transaction fee if we're in like a no arbitrage world. But MEV can also exist over the span of multiple blocks. There are opportunities that are only able to be captured via a reorg. You can actually turn some opportunities that would otherwise be single block MEV into multiple block MEV and require a reorg for them. But there's some that's just inherently unable to be captured in a single block, kind of regardless of how you design it. So like one example would be if I'm a miner, open a massive CDP or massive leverage position on chain, and I realize I'm going to lose money, and I just reorg out of existence, like it never happened. So that would be another example. But we already talked about even standard transaction fees unrelated to any of these notions of MEV create an incentive to reorg the chain just by virtue of the irregularity of that revenue stream. And so our single block capturable MEV, it does the same. It creates the same incentive to reorg the chain and for consensus instability. And of course, we can now just view those demand-based TX fees as one particular form of MEV. It doesn't actually matter if you're competing over a DEX arbitrage or scarce block space. As long as the revenue stream is irregular, it's MEV and creates this incentive. So there's, if you really take this thinking and extrapolate it out, MEV can exist on any time scale. All MEV contributes to an incentive to reorg the chain cumulative across all time scales. So you could say that all MEV exists all of the time. It's really, not a fun thought experiment. Okay, now you would ask, and this is where we're going to start diverging from what Flash Boys 2.0 covered. Phil's paper is pretty specific to Ethereum. can we construct a different method of transaction ordering, some kind of fee scheme, which either prevents MEV from existing or just from being externalized as irregular minor revenue? So can we come up with some way that, even if the stacks arbitrage plays out, that we avoid it creating some kind of perverse incentive? And the answer is actually no, for 3 reasons. The first is that no blockchain can know, is a priori unable to know how much MEV is contained in any given transaction. Whether any given transaction contains MEV, it's just not possible. This is like obviously the case in Ethereum, where anything, applications can do anything. In fact, you may have no idea what they're doing. It's also true of Bitcoin. So quoting Hasu, the Bitcoin system is highly optimized for the transfer of Bitcoins, but there are limits to the extent to which the storage of arbitrary data can be discouraged, because this arbitrary data can represent unbounded value outside of the Bitcoin network and injects potentially limitless MEV, which we'll come back to in a second, but just keep that in mind. Okay, the other 2 reasons why you can't construct a fee scheme which gets rid of MEV. A user is willing to pay as much for transaction ordering as the MEV profit opportunity admitted. There's no free lunch, no money on the ground, no arbitrage. There's no way to express this demand in protocol. Miners and users will collude in off-protocol markets. Therefore, transaction fees must be able to be proportional to MEV, or you're going to get like off-protocol collusion, and the transaction fees, like no one will actually use them. So for Ethereum folks, EIP 1559, the fee scheme upgrade has a base fee. It burns some ether in every transaction. It's pretty interesting stuff. But it still has a tip auction component, because if it didn't, tip auction being this normal bidding war like we just saw as it currently exists in Ethereum, what we call priority gas auctions. If it didn't, you would just get off protocol collusion. Now, lastly, we know that transaction fees must be able to be proportional to MEV, or they just won't get used, and you'll see off-protocol collusion. So transaction fees which are proportional to MEV, as we've already learned, are themselves MEV. It's kind of an incompleteness type thing. It's very tricky. There's no way to avoid it. So what have we learned? We now have a couple more points. Summarizing that whole section on MEV, user behavior occurring at the application layer can create incentives for consensus participants, which are not contemplated in the core protocol. All forms of MEV are inevitably able to be externalized as irregular minor revenues, and therefore encourage consensus instability. Exactly as we've talked about before in the context of those non-deterministic transaction fees and just now. And then lastly, the quantity and magnitude of all hypothetically possible MEV vectors is always infinite for all blockchains, which is just to say, there's some pathological world in which Bitcoin is, the Bitcoin blockchain is only used to transact like $10 trillion of a stable coin, or, some other off-chain asset, and it's worth double spending it because that's worth a lot more than the value of the BTC minor revenue stream. The point here just being, you don't know what's going on, you can't know what's going on. It's hypothetically, you can always have infinite MEV. It's tough. All right, the last point in here, before we get to kind of the practical discussion, is that dimensionality is a curse. Although the potential for perverse MEV incentives is necessarily infinite in any blockchain context, rather all of them, the rate at which MEV practically accumulates can differ. And I would posit conjecture here that the more levers you have to play with, the more ways there are for MEV to manifest itself, and in general, the faster MEV will accumulate. So in Bitcoin, we can think of irregular transaction fees, block block-based, demand-based HTLCs, and colored coins potentially. And like we mentioned before, there's some pathological thought experiment that you can come up with where this kind of tips everything over, but in practice, it's a bit hard to imagine. Now, Ethereum, on the other hand, is empirically already seeing behavior driven by an uncountable number of MEV vectors. Nobody feels like they can see the lower bound, and there's pretty much uniform consensus that MEV incentives are likely to continue increasing in quantity and magnitude, like practically. Not that they theoretically can, but that's actually what's happening. So we call the difference between what can happen, like how many levers there are to play with on, for example, Bitcoin versus Ethereum at their application layers, their dimensionalities. Like abstractly, the degrees of freedom within which asymptotic incentive behavior may independently vary. And another conjecture here that limiting dimensionality on any blockchain requires hard in-protocol constraints on allowed application layer behavior. So if it were discovered that Lightning channels created like a ton of MEV and that they threatened Bitcoin's consensus stability, we could probably disable their opcodes and like probably preclude or at least like make that behavior less practical. In contrast, if it were discovered that DEXs pose similar risks to Ethereum, there's absolutely no way that we could preclude all possible implementations of a DEX at the level of the EVM. Solidity code golf being a thing, QED. We could fork off individual implementations, but again, we can't prevent the general behavior without either permissioning contract deployment or constraining the EVM to such a degree that it's no longer really like a general. It can't perform general computation. And if we are forced to fork something off once, but then can't prevent that behavior from happening again in the future, it's a tough spot to be in. Okay, so Bitcoin versus Ethereum. Bitcoin's dimensionality is minimal. This is really like a core design principle. It's a bit of a different way of thinking about, the approach that Bitcoin takes to security, potentially unintentionally. But in any case, Bitcoin's dimensionality is minimized as either an implicit or explicit design goal. It can only do a very small set of things. It's optimized to do those things. Ethereum, on the other hand, has arbitrarily high dimensionality. You can't preclude any kind of behavior from happening on it, just as a practical matter, without either throwing out the EVM or permissioning what contracts are able to be deployed. So hypothetically, the dimensionality here is arbitrarily high. Any behavior is possible and not able to be precluded. Okay. So lastly, on this is kind of a zoomed in point, but there are security additive incentives other than inflationary block rewards. I put a couple of examples down here, and this is like a more nuanced point that doesn't get discussed as frequently as MEV generally, but there are examples of fee constructions, or rather, kind of user taxes, which do add, to miners or validators incentives to continue securely extending a blockchain. In Ethereum, EIP 1559's base fee burns are, although not the tip auction revenue, which remains MEV. State rents could be additive to security. There are probably many other potential constructions, that we could come up with to like tax users for their demand for like scarce computational resources, or just levy in some way that feels like it makes sense. But it's not possible to guarantee that those incentives will scale proportionally to or asymptotically dominate MEV incentives. So, the idea here is basically that MEV any kind of behavior can create MEV. Nth order interactions between any kind of behaviors can hypothetically create MEV. You don't know what's going to happen. And, in contrast, any fee scheme which is additive to security is like necessarily not going to be guaranteed proportional to MEV. So like EIP 1559's base fee is a good example. They're a fee levied on every transaction within Ethereum where you're forced to burn like some amount of ether when you make it. This scales mostly approximately in the absolute number of transactions that users make on Ethereum. And like one simple pathological counterexample to how those incentives aren't guaranteed to dominate MEV, not that they're intended to, but just that they can't, would be if only a single transaction is made each day, which creates a $1 trillion front-running opportunity. Potentially not likely, but you can't design any fee construction which is proportional to MEV without it being itself MEV. So it's a very tough problem. And with that, we are left with our 3 axioms here, and now we're going to get to interoperability. The summary of the third would be that MEV generally increases more quickly the more dimensions there are for it to grow in terms of behavioral dimensions. And the only way to limit it is by constraining possible application layer behavior in protocol. And then security additive incentive constructions are lower dimensional than MEV and cannot be guaranteed to scale proportionally to or asymptotically dominate MEV incentives. Extrapolating out, these are my thoughts. These are just opinions, but if Bitcoin doesn't work, all of our geese are probably cooked. Modulo block rewards going to 0 in the extreme long term, which is kind of a separate conversation. But yeah, if it doesn't work, it's probably not good for the rest of us. I think Ethereum has basically 2 potential futures. The first is that it works for some combination of that ETH is simply so valuable that it can socialize the cost of securing the entire Ethereum network, essentially invariant to the scale of MEV incentives. So this isn't an argument that ETH is forced to grow in value faster than MEV, and that it's just that in practice it might. Maybe it never matters. And then on top of that, you have some cherries in terms of EIP's 1559's burn base fees, state rents, things like that. And then lastly, if users are getting front run all the time, MEV is more obviously harmful. Application developers may become incented to adopt design patterns which minimize MEV exposure. And on the whole, things it might just be fine. That's a totally feasible future. On the other hand, if MEV does come to dominate the value of miner security incentives, it'll stop working. Consensus will become unstable. And I would posit that if it happens to Ethereum, it probably implies that the security of any Ethereum-like system with arbitrary application layer behavior is pathologically degenerate and will necessarily become unstable on a long enough time scale. And I think this would be quite disappointing, but it's worth considering as a possibility. Okay, slide 40. The security of interoperability, which is the subject of this talk. Interoperability, 2 poles. Bitcoin, there have been analogies used for MEV, like dark forest. I'm going to throw the book 3-Body Problem. I personally like to think about Bitcoin like a black domain. It is completely non-interoperable. It has no understanding of external consensus messages. It cannot punish misbehavior in any other consensus process. And in fact, as a general matter, it cannot, no behavior can be conditioned on the results of an external consensus process. So it has functionally 0 interoperability. That's why it's hard to make a Bitcoin peg. Ethereum, on the other hand, is called a dark forest for its MEV dynamics. It's high interoperability. It's nearly frictionless interoperability, as all the arbitrary behavior happening on it is homogenously secured by ether inflation, the same incentive stream. And uniformly sharing this security means that the incentives of all applications are externalized on all others. And like we talked about before, without provisioning deployment, or this should be permissioning deployment, you can't preclude any kind of specific behavior. So everything is externalized on everything else all the time. And it may be, is not guaranteed to be, but may be pathologically degenerate for the reasons, again, that we discussed. All right, so we got 2 poles of interoperability here. Bitcoin's dimensionality is minimal, its interoperability is minimal. Ethereum's dimensionality arbitrarily high, interoperability also high. Okay, so when we say Bitcoin's a black domain, it's because of this. Here's a consensus message coming from Bitcoin to Ethereum. Nice. It checks, the headers or whatever, SPV proof, press switch, there's great libraries for this. It's good stuff. Okay, here's in red Ethereum consensus message going towards Bitcoin. It just bounces off. It has no conception of Ethereum, what that means. So it's completely ignorant to the rest of the world. It's minimally interoperable, potentially beautiful for that reason. Okay, this is why two-way Bitcoin pegs are tough. You can't punish misbehavior in another system on Bitcoin, so you have to deal with all the incentives on the other side, just as an aside. Is there a third door? Is there a third door here where our dimensionality is not arbitrarily high, where behavior is not sort of infinitely possible at the application layer, and interoperability is still possible? So we don't wall ourselves off from ignorance to the rest of the world. And there are a bunch of questions that I/we and others have kind of considered in this context, different ways that you could think about this. I'll post this presentation because these are all pretty nuanced afterwards. But the basic idea is, like, does there exist a construction which can admit a high degree of interoperability without arbitrary dimensionality? There are a couple ways you could take this. Number one, that's probably just interesting on its own, is something that doesn't really exist, with Bitcoin and Ethereum as the two examples we've looked at so far. And if Ethereum-like systems do not work out or pathologically degenerate, we may need to figure out another option here. So I would posit the Cosmos is the third door. I'll explain this very quickly. All right, in the little middle here, each of these things are Cosmos zones. Everything inside those circles those are consensus processes. Overlapping circles represent consensus processes which are sharing security or tightly coupling their security to some degree. The little dots inside of it are just like application behaviors. I think, I put the hub in the middle there. It's like pretty highly connected. So you got a bunch of different application-specific chains, some of which are more connected to others than others, some of which are less, and a bunch of them are talking to each other because they can all understand one another's consensus messages. So I would posit that this kind of system, one way to think about it, is one with finite and organically discoverable dimensionality, and that still admits interoperability. And there are potentially, although not certainly, benefits to variable levels of interoperability, for kind of the incentive externalization reasons discussed. It's also pretty likely that in ETH2, interoperability looks pretty similar from like a UX perspective as Cosmos, especially if we get to ETH 1.5, which is like everything becomes roll up. Anyway, the point here just being interesting system. We don't have to give up that anything can happen, that any application layer behavior is possible and possibly will externalize the incentives it creates, good or parasitic, on me. It's finite, and yet we still get a high degree of interoperability, subject to some additional security considerations, or that you need to think a little bit harder about, like, do I actually want to talk to this other thing, which is probably a good thing, or potentially at least. All right, so here's just an example. Something Cosmos can do that's kind of interesting. One of these guys went rogue. 2/3 are malicious. This little red guy down here is freaking out. So it goes Byzantine, it starts double spending IBC messages, which only incurs like a 1/3 necessary slashing or attributable fault. A little interesting as compared to double spending on your own network of full nodes. And so it goes Byzantine, it starts double spending on a bunch of others. Oh no, everything that's very closely connected to it, let's say the distance, represents the degree of reliance it has on this red guy here, or on its nearest neighbors. Kind of burgundy, it's not good. They create some kind of negative incentives for their neighbors as well. But at the end of the day, it can kind of get sloughed off cleanly, and like we're left with the rest of the network, probably being a little worse for wear, but in general, hopefully hasn't completely toppled over. And the pitch on why this might be a benefit is that if everything is running on top of one system and it topples over, everything that was running on that one system has now toppled over with it. And there are some like pretty good reasons that you could expect that is possible. So that's my talk. That's why I think of Cosmos as potentially a third door in blockchain design interoperability, and why I find it very interesting. And then I think a bunch of other speakers have raised tons of more idiosyncratic and questions. All right. Do we have time for one or two questions?
We probably have room for just one.
Okay. Um, the top comment from Sunny, how should we think about consensus instability in the context of guaranteed finality consensus protocols and standard? There are a bunch of different ways that you could take this question. I think that I would consider it to be an open question in the sense that, like, the degree to which security will be coupled between zones, or whether the primary attack vector will be like IBC double spends on other chains versus attempts to revert finality, or rather finalized state transitions on like some given chain itself, are in general more economically efficient ways of extracting MEV that relies on this. It's a tough question to answer, absolutely, because you can still construct pathological kind of examples of cases in which, regardless of the fact that you're going to necessarily incur an attributable fault, potentially you need to control like 2/3 of the stake, and will with certainty make an attributable fault from all of them, to like revert a finalized chain of whatever you're actually working on, rather than double spending on another. Like you could still construct an example where like the payoff from that is just so great that like you might expect it to happen. And I would say that like I don't have a great answer as to whether it makes it. It feels like it probably makes it in practice like less likely that it'll happen, or raises the bar to like how juicy the the incentive to take it over needs to be, like relative to the cost that you're going to incur and the revenue stream that you would alternately receive if you just continued mining or validating rather correctly. But it doesn't eliminate the incentive, and like you can still construct pathological examples of like where it would probably happen. So I don't know, interesting question, probably a lot more to explore there.
Awesome. So we're out of time. We're going to transition to the next session now. Thanks so much. This is great.